Thank you so much, Rebecca. It's really a pleasure to welcome Batya to Berkeley. I first want to mention, of course, this book that she's just written, which we're talking about tonight, Bad News, How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy. And I want to encourage everyone to go buy the book, and you might argue with the book, you might have strong reactions to the book, you might fling the book across the room in disagreement at some point, but everyone should be engaging with the ideas in this book. Strong reactions are always a sign of important ideas. So Becca gave the formal introduction to Batya, and I just want to say something a little more personal. Batya is my good friend, and we became friends actually over Zoom during COVID. It's an experience probably that various people had of getting to know people and becoming close to people who you'd never met before over an extended period of time. And we did so largely through what Jews traditionally call chavruta, which is paired learning sessions where we discussed and debated common texts every week. Our learning's been on ice for the last couple of months because things got a little bit crazy, but hopefully we'll resume again soon. And what I appreciated so much from our first conversation was Batya's ability to engage and argue forcefully and argue very passionately, and you'll hear her do that tonight, I'm quite sure, but also to listen and to show a kind of openness to all people and all thoughtful perspectives. And Batya and I both value deeply the importance of being able to disagree without necessarily being disagreeable or personalizing our political debates. And so you will hear us disagree about various things as we discuss her book, but do so in a way that Jews traditionally call lishma, in the name of a higher purpose and with great respect. So I'm going to start my timer here, so if you see me glance at this phone or touch it, it's not because I'm checking my messages, God forbid. I just want to clear that up. Okay, so Batya, you've written a book that tells a story about what you call wokeness and how you argue it's undermining our democracy, specifically through media. So I'd like you to start by just kind of laying out what you see as the big stakes argument of the book, and along the way, if you can define how you're using the term wokeness, I think that'll be really helpful for our audience.
So first of all, Ethan, thank you so much for having me. Rebecca, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm so grateful to the Diller Institute and to all of you for coming out. It's really an honor for me to be here, not just because I got my PhD here, but also because I know that a lot of you are on the left the way that I am, and maybe don't agree with a lot of the ideas in the book. And it's funny because on my Uber ride over here from the airport, my driver was from Oakland, and he asked me why I was here, and then he asked me what the book was about, and I was telling him, and he was sort of like, it's going to be a bloodbath. Why are you going to Berkeley? But I just want to make the point that I make a lot, which is that the point of a debate is not necessarily to convince people. It's to give them a choice. And so I'm going to do my best to represent the views in my book in a way that I think will most be able to convince you that it's a legitimate point of view and one worth engaging in. But I don't want you to feel erased by that in any way. And I'm very excited to hear all of your questions as well. What is wokeness? The word woke started as black slang for staying aware of systemic racism, state-sponsored racism. And I, as a lefty, think that is very, very important. There are still areas in America where we are struggling with state-sponsored racism. Police brutality is one, mass incarceration, our public education disparities. To me, it's not woke to care about those things. I use the word woke now in the way that sociologists do, to refer to a phenomenon that happened much more recently, where white liberals have become much more extreme in their views on race than Black and Latino Americans. And they call this the Great Awakening. Now, I am not insensate to the criticism of having appropriated a word from Black slang that describes something important and using it as a pejorative. I think that's a legitimate criticism, but it does refer to a phenomenon that I think is extremely important to critique. So it is not woke to push or care about police reform. Every American of conscience should do so. And Republican Senator Tim Scott was not being woke when he wrote a police reform bill. You know, it's not woke to demand an end to mass incarceration. That's extremely important. Every American of conscience should do so. And President Trump was not being woke when he passed the First Step Act that released 5,000 black men from prison. That's not what wokeness is. Wokeness is when you demand defunding the police instead of police reform, a view that's opposed by 81% of black Americans, but is very beloved by affluent, highly educated white liberals, the kind that run the op-ed section at the New York Times, okay? That's what I'm talking about. You know, it is not woke to demand education reform. It's woke to call standardized testing white supremacy when black parents are begging for a good education for their children, okay? And the argument that I make in the book, I wanted to understand, how did this great awakening happen? How did white liberals give themselves the excuse of surpassing the people that they are supposed to be advocating on behalf of, the people that we have abandoned over and over, you know, the American descendants of slaves? Like, how did that happen in the name of social justice? That's what I tried to understand. And the same sociologists who identified the Great Awakening tied it back to the media, to the liberal media. What they found was, and again, we've noticed this, I think a lot of lefties and liberals noticed this, a shift in the way that our media, our liberal media, national liberal news media, talks about race over the last 10 years. But you don't have to rely on your anecdotal impressions. The same sociologists who clocked that shift in white liberal opinion to see it outpace black and Latino Americans in its extremity on race have found that there was just a total skyrocketing of the use of woke words in the New York Times and the Washington Post and NPR and the Atlantic and Vox and all of these outlets. They just started talking about things like white privilege and oppression and marginalization, and coupling the words marginalization with the words people of color just exponentially, starting in 2011, 2012. It was a direct response to a business incentive, a business profit motive, which is digital media. And that led me to ask, why did this happen? When did this happen? And what I found was that, you know, American journalism, it used to be this working class trade. It used to be a job that people, it was a blue collar job. You know, journalists used to live next door to cops, and they didn't make that much more money than them. And over the course of the 20th century, there was a status revolution in American journalism. Now journalists live next door to corporate lawyers, and they make a little bit less than them. And along with this status revolution, American journalists have abandoned the working class of all races, And they today, unconsciously, I believe, they are using a moral panic around race to distract from the real divide in America, which is one of class. That's in a nutshell, in a long nutshell, a big nutshell, the argument of the book.
Great. So, yeah, that was a really good distillation of like the first half of the book. But you then argue that the election of Donald Trump played a crucial role in accelerating the developments that you've just described. So can you talk a little bit about why you think that was so important?
Well, I'd actually say the opposite. I would say the developments I describe, I think, led in a big way to Donald Trump's election.
Okay. So yes, you're right. You also make that argument, but then you say that Trump, you know, gave the media certain other incentives, opportunities to push these stories forward. So talk about both. I mean, because I think they are both important to the story you're trying to tell.
Do you know how many times Trump's name appeared in the New York Times in 2017? It's 97,000 times. That's once every 250 words. It's twice every single article. Unless you think that, okay, it's a president, you know, you got to talk about a president, right? So guess how many times President Obama's name appeared in the New York Times in his second year in office? It was 37,000 times. It's a difference of 60,000 times, 60,000 articles, okay? That was not driven by a journalistic motive. That was driven by a profit motive. And the reason for that is that used to be journalism, we judged whether journalism was good or bad. We evaluated it based on how many people, how big the reach was. That shifted with the internet. Online, the way you judge success in journalism is through engagement. How many impressions an article creates, how many comments on Facebook, how many shares on Twitter. And we know, obviously, everyone here knows that the most engaged readers are the most extreme, and that emotion drives engagement. So in 2018, the New York Times created a new way of tracking the emotions of their readers. It's called Project Feels. They had their data science team started asking young, affluent readers, millennials who make over $100,000, $130,000 a year, to rate how certain articles made them feel and how much they made them feel. And what they found was, not surprisingly, the more emotional, the more the reader was feeling, the longer they stayed on the page, and the more likely they were to click on an ad. So that was step one. Step two, they created a machine learning algorithm that could predict how an article was going to make a reader feel, and they now sell that to advertisers. So when Armani comes to the New York Times and says, I would like to buy an ad, the New York Times can say, no problem. How would you like the reader to be feeling when they encounter your ad, and how much? Right? It's like Facebook. They essentially hacked and monetized our emotions. That's why President Trump's name appeared 97,000 times in the New York Times in 2017, right? Because he makes affluent white liberals, who are the target audience of the New York Times, feel things very, very deeply, which makes them buy things, which makes them very valuable to the New York Times, right? What happened with digital media was you used to have all of these liberal outlets which were each catering to a different audience, each catering to a different readership. And essentially what you have now is The Atlantic and Vox and the New York Times and the Washington Post and NPR are all going for the same 6, 7, 8 million highly affluent, highly educated progressives who live in coastal cities, who are going to spend in a way that will impress advertisers, who are going to pay for that subscription to the New York Times because it makes them feel like part of an elite club. All of these outlets are now catering to the same elite readership, and it is that has driven the way that they cover race more than anything else. It's about class. It's not about race. And that's why you see things like defund the police, defund the police, defund the police, instead of people going into working class neighborhoods and asking people, what do you need to not get beat up and insulted by the police? What would you like to see? How can we help you fulfill the dreams for your children? Because the moral panic around race that we're seeing in the liberal media is just the last stage of American journalists who are now part of the elite abandoning the working class of all races.
So, strong words, and I'm going to ask you some, I'm going to ask you some challenging questions in a few minutes. But let's go back for a minute. First of all, class is a really important part of your framework, but I'm not sure you've had a chance to fully develop that in this conversation in a way that our audience will totally follow. And connected to that is a question that you alluded to a few minutes ago, which maybe you can go back and answer. I think the two are interconnected, and that is, as you say, you argue that this turn of the liberal media helped to drive the election of Donald Trump. And I believe you make that argument in part because of class divides and class resentments. So can you explain the connection between those two?
8 million people voted for President Obama and then voted for Donald Trump. I mean, okay, so already now we can admit that people have a reason for voting for him that's not racism, right? Like that should have been obvious from day one, but instead, of course, the media leaned into this narrative that every person who voted for him was racist. And it's not just that. He won 67% of whites without a college degree. Like that is the class divide right there. And if you look at Glenn Youngkin's numbers, he won 76% of Americans without a college degree. He won up to 50% of Latino Americans. Like, to call these people white supremacists is, okay, fine. I'm happy to be the kind of white supremacist that 50% of Latinos are. I just think that at that point you're taking the, like, white supremacy is really bad and was a part of this nation, and to dilute it like that, to use it as a political weapon against people who our side abandoned, right? The Democrats are the reason that all of those jobs were shipped out to China, right? The reason that all of these working class Americans are downwardly mobile, right?
You're talking about
with help, yes. I'm talking about
the policies of the
yes,
early
yes,
years.
exactly.
Yeah,
yes,
with a lot of help
with a lot of help from
Republicans.
Republicans, no doubt, true. The class divide. If you look at the number one predictor for whether a county would go to Trump or not was how many deaths of despair there were. The deaths of despair are the opioid addictions, death by suicide, and death by alcoholism. And that was the number one correlator. You could track where he was doing well. And instead of sitting down and saying, my God, people are killing themselves out of despair because of the downward mobility of the working class and the middle class in America, they literally can't see themselves, any place for them in America, they're literally killing themselves. And we yesterday just found out 100,000 people died of drug overdoses last year. That, instead of sitting down and saying, why, how do they not see us as the side that cares about them? This is a moral emergency for the Democrats. Like, a moral emergency, we've lost the white working class. We're losing, working class people of color every single year. Like, what are we doing wrong? Instead of saying that, they just said, oh no, they're all racist, right? It was like, it was so clearly a way of hiding a class divide where the people that used to see in the Democrats their champions, right? We used to be the side of labor, now see the Republicans as their side. And it's not because the Republicans are doing anything for them economically. It's just that they don't sneer at their values while abandoning them economically. So it's just so easy for me to imagine a Democratic Party and a left that looked at this emergency and said, oh, wow, we failed in our number one mission, which is to elevate all Americans and to make sure that, there's equality before the law, equality for everybody, and, that these class divides are minimized. The party and our side really leaned into these culture wars around identity, and as now, you see this every day you turn on the news and you can see this happening. They're using what I believe is the real pain of Black Americans, the real ways in which we've abandoned Black America, they're using that in order to fuel division and to hide a class divide that has very much benefited our side.
Okay, so you see that class divide as really the key to issues of what you would describe as racial justice, right? And you see these class issues as the real issues that need to be focused on in the struggle for greater equality for African Americans. And if I follow your argument correctly, you're saying, I think you used the phrase at one point, that white liberals want to feel on the right side of history without having to pay the cost that would be necessary for really a fundamental economic restructuring of society that would benefit all, in some ways especially African Americans who are facing things like intergenerational poverty and systemic racism in the criminal justice system. And so rather than moving toward those structural reforms, they are more comfortable talking about what you define as wokeness. Is that a fair summary?
Close enough, yeah.
Well, if you want to correct me on anything I said, please do.
This is how I would rephrase it. The working class of all races is downwardly mobile and has been abandoned by both sides from an economic point of view. That should be, whatever side is addressing that is on the right side of history, and it's not ours right now.
Right.
Criminal justice reform, police brutality, intergenerational poverty in inner cities. There's no longer a debate between the parties on this. So for the last decade, the Republicans have been at the forefront of criminal justice reform. You probably don't know that because our media won't report on it. But Georgia, Idaho, Iowa have been overseeing mass prisoner releases from a Christian point of view, because it's wrong from a Christian point of view to deny people, a second chance, to deny people grace. We never hear about this. The First Step Act, it barely got covered, barely got covered. So there's no debate anymore about this stuff. Police brutality. Senator Tim Scott wrote a police reform bill. Yes, it didn't include qualified immunity. It's true. It didn't go, in the direction that the Democrats wanted. So they blocked it. I mean, it's like there's no debate anymore about those issues. There's no racist side anymore. That to me is just, it's just a way of hiding the class divide, because it's totally invented, it's totally manufactured at this point. There's no debate along those issues. That doesn't mean we've solved them, but to me, like, to be on a side that's using the filibuster to block a police reform bill, and then 3 months later calling the filibuster white supremacist, that's what the Democrats did in the last 6 months, right? So to me, that it's you know, the racial justice issues, they still exist and they're still important, but there's no longer a debate about that. The left just won that culture war, just like they won the LGBTQ rights culture war. That is no longer a fight. You go into the South, you go to evangelical churches, they're welcoming in LGBTQ couples. Like, that's just not a fight anymore. But the class thing is, you know, the class divide really is, and nobody will talk about it.
Right. Okay. So, but you have just acknowledged areas where race is still a fundamental issue in American society. And so I guess one of my questions is, you write a book here, and you've spoken already a little bit about it, that is basically critical of wokeness wholesale, right? That you think wokeness is, whatever its origins, it's doing terrible damage to our public discourse right now. And my question is partly, strategically, it seems to me that approach has a cost, because many people who share your goals of racial justice are going to feel, when you're so dismissive of wokeness, that you're not an ally, that you're taking up what they would see as, you've said unfairly, Republican talking points, and dismissing their cause. So my question is, why not say wokeness started as a move for racial justice, but it's lost its way, and it needs to go back to what the core issues are, rather than just saying wokeness is bad?
That's a great question. Thank you so much for that question. So the first point I want to make is, I see myself as a lefty. I'm pretty much a socialist, but I often have people say to me, these are just conservative talking points. And to me, that's sort of like, that's a win for me. I don't identify the word conservative as an insult. I think that's it's pretty juvenile to think that that's a slur. But moreover, like, if you want to say that the conservatives are the ones who care about class, we're no longer the side that cares about class, you really want to cede that to the Republicans? Like, I can't help you. Like, that's a win for them. That's a win for the conservatives. That's not an insult to me, right? I just don't identify with that talking point at all, you know? Or AOC saying only old people use the word woke. It's like, I'm not embarrassed to be old. Like, I don't think that's an insult, you know? I'm not in college. Like, that doesn't hurt my feelings, you know? Like, as far as why, I am on the side of 81% of Black Americans. So I am an enemy to the 19% calling for defunding the police. I am on the other side than them, and I will do everything in my power to stop that, because I see myself as on the side of the silenced working class, you know, people living in intergenerational poverty, in crime-ridden poor neighborhoods who liberals are too embarrassed to talk about. So I do see myself as being on the other side of the wokes, because to me, wokeness, you know, is not actually addressing the problems. It's not just that it's gone too far. It is at odds with the very people we need to be helping.
Right. I understand that. But at the same time, I mean, you yourself have said that you think that the movement in the wake of the murder of George Floyd was really important in a lot of ways, and that police brutality is a real issue. Now, many of those people define their work, you know, to change the criminal justice system. They define it as part of wokeness, right? So I guess the question is, and I mean, this can extend to anti-racism, right? This is a movement that you're also very critical of in the book, and that I don't think means one thing, right? And so the folks who were out there in the streets, millions of them marching after the murder of George Floyd, many of those people would define their action as in some broad way anti-racist. And so the question is partly, are we really helping the tenor of the public conversation if we end up spending a lot of our energy, you know, kind of trying to tear down anti-racism or wokeness in a wholesale way, rather than saying, well, those movements need to focus on other things?
So there was a Pew study that came out last week. They've divided up the left and the right into different subgroups, right? And the progressive group, guess how many Americans are progressive? You'll never guess. I mean, it's
15%.
15%. It's 6%. 6% of Americans identify as progressive. And guess how many black Americans identify as progressive?
2.
6%. Right? So progressives who have identified themselves as the side fighting, the anti-racist side, have the view of 6% of black Americans. Okay? Donald Trump got 19% of black men, right? Like, but that's just to show you the like what we're talking about here, okay? 6% are progressive, and it's not just a term. It's not just a term, right? It's for example the opinion that America's institutions are so deeply racist and unfair to certain minorities and ethnicities that they need to be torn down and rebuilt afresh. Very, very few black and Latino Americans think that. Okay. That's
what you're defining as anti-racism.
Yes.
And I guess my point is that's not how all anti-racists, or necessarily even most of them, define themselves.
I mean, well, the avatars of the movement definitely do. Ibrahim X. Kendi's view is very much that every minute that you're not talking about racism, you're being racist. That's in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, right? And he is sort of the poster child of it. And a lot of the discourse in the media, you know, you turn on CNN, you turn on MSNBC, you open the New York Times. The entire New York Times is enthralled to this, because they only want those 6% as their readers. Like it makes perfect sense when you start thinking about it that way. They are no longer interested in having readers who would make their, you know, highly educated, affluent readership, who is their target audience, to make them uncomfortable. Like they don't want those readers anymore. And the sad thing is, it's very profitable. It is very profitable to lean into that 6%. But that 6% is the most white, the most highly educated, and the most affluent of all of the liberal side of the spectrum. That's who our culture is catering to, whose economic interests it's catering to, in the name of anti-racism. And so yes, I am on the other side of that.
Okay. We should move on. In part because we're here for a Diller Institute event, but also because it's an issue that you raise in the book, and I know it's an important issue to you, and that is the impact of what you describe as wokeness on the way that Jews and Israel are portrayed in the media. So can you say a little bit about how you think that woke media is undermining the position of Jews, even, I think I'm characterizing you fairly, sometimes enabling anti-Semitism in a certain way. You write in your book that, quote, the re-racialization of society into a crude binary where power is a one-way street and one racial group uses it to oppress and dominate another. In this context, the left has long cast the Jews in the role of the oppressor, proximate to whiteness, if not worse. So can you say a little bit of what you mean by that, and then how you see it extending to a lot of media coverage of Israel as well?
Okay, I want to be very clear. I still think, you've heard me say this before, I still think that our generation of Jews, are the luckiest Jews to ever walk planet Earth. I don't think anti-Semitism is the biggest threat to America or the biggest threat to American Jews. It is rising, it is true. So the only Jews to ever walk planet Earth who were luckier than us was us 5 years ago, before it started to rise, okay? I don't see it as a great threat. It is rising. It's rising on the left and it's rising on the right. And it's rising, because of just the breakdown of the concept of the common good. It's rising because of the rise of conspiratorial thinking on both sides and because of wokeness. But again, we're not even the primary, when it comes to woke roadkill, it's like the working class of all races, and then, Jews, right? And that, I don't think we're the primary target or the most important target. I mean, it's terrible that it's rising, and if you wear a yarmulke like Ethan does, if you identify as Jewish, especially in New York, in a lot of liberal cities, it's not great. But, this is something that, Shvera Yitzu Zayin, like and it's just not, I'm not an alarmist about that. I don't believe because I just don't think that it is as threatening as a lot of people make it out to be, sometimes for political gain, on either side.
Sure.
So I just want to preface it by saying that. The way that I think about it is the progressive left today is what Thomas Piketty calls a Brahmin left. The Brahmins are the highest caste in Hindu society. And Piketty, who's a French economist, he noted that over the course of the last 50, 60 years, the left went from representing labor to being really the bastion of highly educated elites, not just in America, all across Europe, all across the developed world. To where you have the left representing things like environmentalism and the right representing the working class, and increasingly issues like immigration, that there's been this sort of splintering off and a reversal of what you would have once thought were the sides, right? I'm sure a lot of you can remember, like 40 years ago, even 30 years ago, the Democrats were the side of close that border, right? Protect working class jobs, right? And the right was the side of, no, let's have open borders, get all this cheap labor, right? And there's been a real reversal. Today the right is saying, we got to secure that border, and the left is saying, no, we have to have open borders. We have to make sure that anybody who's looking for a better life can come here, right? That's a reversal based on class, right? Although of course the left has clothed it as racist to oppose open borders. So this shift to this Brahmin leftism that's really about the economic interests of elites, of highly educated and increasingly affluent coastal communities. This has brought with it anti-Zionism, because a lot of the ideas in the Brahmin left agenda come from the academy. And anti-Zionism has long been a mainstay of the academy. And just as, the liberal media has helped mainstream ideas like open borders and anti-racism and intersectionality, it's also been mainstreaming anti-Zionism at the same time, to where, because everything has to be seen through this binary, right? Like white supremacist versus person of color. White supremacist has all the power, person of color is totally oppressed and has no agency. That is now how this group, this community sees Israel, right? They say that Israelis are like the white supremacists, even though the majority of Israelis are people of color, and they talk about the Palestinians as though they are, a civil rights struggle, an absolutely disgusting comparison, comparing Dr. King's nonviolent movement to a movement that contains the Second Intifada that murdered 1,000 civilians, essentially. But to me, it's not that it's anti-Semitic. It's just so stupid. It's just so wrong to take a racial lens from America and import it, onto Israel. Now, the good news is this move doesn't have much further to go, because there's no buy-in from the working class. A lot of Jews are saying now, oh, America's becoming like Europe. In Europe, it's quite chic to hate Jews. It's quite chic in upper class society, in educated society, Jews do not feel comfortable at all. And that was never true here, and that is becoming true here. In left-wing, highly educated, circles, it is now considered okay to discriminate socially against Jews if they identify as Zionists. But it's not in Europe. In Europe, when you say George Soros, the working class has had 1,000 years of being primed to hear any Jewish name, and it's like the spidey sense goes up and they get super excited. That's in the blood there. It is soaked with Jewish blood and resentment against Jews that is built into the class resentment. We don't have that here. We're very, very lucky. We just don't have that. The working class in America is very religious. It's quite Zionist. We don't have that. And so I just don't think that the anti-Zionism that has really, infiltrated into the left has much further to go, because it is part of the Brahmin left agenda. It's not, even the Democratic, there was a vote on the Iron Dome, right? Which I don't think we should be funding the Iron Dome. They can fund it themselves. Why are we paying for that? Why should working class American taxpayers be paying for some other country's weapons? But 420 Congress members voted to fund it. So all of this talk about, encroaching anti-Zionism, whatever, I think it's talk.
Oh, okay.
Weren't expecting that, were you?
Not totally. Right. We can. Right. We've been on the same stage arguing a little bit about this before. I think you're underestimating the pockets of the right that are attracted to older anti-Semitic ideas and that are attracted to forms of white nationalism that are not the most extreme forms of white nationalism. It's certainly not a majority of the right or close to a majority of the right, but I think that it is real, and I think there's certain working class people who are also familiar. I mean, I don't think we should underestimate the degree to which anti-Semitism is baked into larger Western culture in a subterranean way, and can also be brought out in pockets of America, even though, of course, you're right that it has a much deeper and longer history in Europe. I'm going to push you a little bit, because you do say in your book that the second greatest casualty of wokeness after the working class are Jews. And I know that anti-Semitism concerns you. And so my question is, if you argue that class is the real divide in American society, and that a focus on race repeatedly is a distraction, then how can we talk about anti-Semitism? That is, if we should be talking about class, that is not going to help us to understand the resurgence of hatred against Jews, because Jews do not face structural inequalities around income or access. And in fact, a focus on class sometimes reinforces notions of Jewish privilege, because statistically speaking, Jews are more educated and more successful by certain metrics. So it seems to me that we have to acknowledge vocally the multivarious ways that race continues to function to even be able to talk about anti-Semitism, which is ultimately still a hatred that racializes Jews in complex ways, sometimes as white, sometimes as not white, sometimes as sort of purely white in a way that's pejorative, often as an evil group conspiring against the common good. But it seems like a class analysis will not get us any closer to understanding contemporary anti-Semitism. And so there seems to me there's a tension between recognizing anti-Semitism as resurgent in American life and telling us we should really stop talking about race and mostly talk about class.
Right. So this, I think we fundamentally disagree about how fundamental or significant the rise in anti-Semitism is. I do think it's related to class. I think it's related to the breakdown of the concept of the common good, of a shared reality.
For sure we agree.
But that happened along class lines.
Right. Okay. Okay. So for you, the causes of anti-Semitism fundamentally are this very small portion of the left that is made anti-Zionism part of a certain kind of racialization of everything.
Well, anti-Semitism. I don't think anti-Zionism is inherently anti-Semitic, but I think that they have made anti-Semitism.
Well, I agree that anti-Zionism is not inherently anti-Semitic.
Yes, it's rising,
but a frequently anti-Semitic form of anti-Zionism. Yes,
and that's right. That's coming from elites on the left, and then yes, there has been a resurgence of white, an emboldening of white supremacists, and like we had the shootings, and then a lot of mentally ill people on the margins of society, sort of coming out of the woodwork, and
Right. Okay. So what you just said about how anti-Semitism is not, we agree that it's not our biggest problem. And I guess, I want to ask you one more question about this. You have a passage in your book that I'm going to read, and then I'm going to ask you to help me understand better what you're really after here. So you're talking about the Women's March, and you quote someone who you clearly think is saying something that is on its face problematic, because you don't analyze the quote for us. And my question is, given the reality that most American Jews are white-skinned, and that we enjoy, therefore, the privilege of walking around and not looking black, which we can agree is not inherent in every single interaction, and that people who are working class whites do not feel or necessarily even experience that privilege in very many contexts. We can agree on that, but it still is something that many people benefit from in daily life. I hope we can also agree on that. You quote this person saying, in effect, white Jews, of which I am one, too often see anti-Semitism in what is really the legitimate anger and despair of black people at being dehumanized and marginalized by a social and economic system made for and perpetuated by white people, of which Jewish Americans have indisputably become much more a part than black Americans. So I guess my question is why...
I wrote that to disagree with it, just so it's clear. I wasn't quoting that because I agree with it.
No, I
just want to make that clear.
No, I know you weren't.
Yeah.
And my point is actually, I wouldn't characterize things exactly this way, but you are attuned, I think you're very sensitively attuned to particularities in different communities. You're attuned to the fact that certain things that mean something in the Jewish community can mean something different in the African American community. And so I was surprised that for you that quote is on its face so clearly just wrong and doesn't seem to contain any truth. And so can you just and if you want, I can hand you the book and you can look at the quote because I'm putting you on the spot. But can you explain to us why this sentiment is just so clearly wrong?
Yeah, she wrote that after a bunch of Haredi Jews were beaten up in the streets by young black men. There was 100 attacks against ultra-Orthodox Jews in New York and New Jersey over the course of 2019. 3/4 of them were by young black kids in Brooklyn. And that was the answer from the left was, oh, they're angry about gentrification. And I just thought that was disgusting.
Well, we could agree about that. Okay. So it's not, but therefore it's not really what she said nearly as much as the context of what she said.
No, because first of all, like the idea that a chassid with with payas is somehow is somehow in mainstream America is the equivalent of some and also it's like the point, the binary is the problem, right?
Yes, agreed.
1,000%. We have a problem with police brutality that a black person is twice as likely to be insulted by a police officer, that they are more likely to have them lay hands on them, beat them up, throw them against a car, and put handcuffs on them. That is a specific problem that plagues a specific community. The generalization out of that to create a binary in which there are virtuous people because of their utter powerlessness on one side and Jews who are totally empowered because of the color of their skin on the other is just totally false. And it's false in a way that is disgusting. Like it's false in a way that is using the logic that the worst humans to ever walk planet Earth used. It's the use of a racial binary, a racial essentialism to hide class, as well as many other things, and to excuse bigotry in a way that we would never do to anybody else. I refuse to excuse the bigotry of a community and to act like they don't have it in them to overcome bigotry. It's disgusting to talk that way about people. Sorry.
No, we fundamentally agree on this. So we're in heated agreement, as happens pretty regularly. But I think that explanation is really helpful. And I think part of what you highlight and what you just said is the fact that this racial binary, one of the reasons that it's really problematic for Jewish Americans specifically is that most Jewish Americans don't feel themselves, even if they have white skin, to be white full stop. We feel like, we don't fit neatly into the racial binary of America by virtue of our experience, by virtue of the history in which Jews have so frequently been racialized as non-white, by virtue of particular ethnic traditions that we feel make us an ethnic minority. And so that binary already makes us uncomfortable, and what you describe is, of course, a doubling down on that binary where powerlessness carries absolute virtue, and because Jews are seen as powerful whites, And this is where we have, I think, a more widespread kind of inflection of at least anti-Semitic stereotypes in the way that Jews are being talked about in the racial binary. We're going to get into our audience in a few minutes here with questions. So before we do that, I want to just give you a chance. We zoomed in there on the particular case of Jews in Israel. I want to zoom back out to 30,000 feet and give you a chance to talk about what you talk about near the end of the book, which is where you think we go from here, right? What do you want our audience to take away in terms of what can we do to improve the discourse? What can we do to kind of rescue class, which, whatever you and I disagree about, I agree with you very strongly that income inequality is a hugely neglected issue and a hugely important issue, and we're not able to make progress on a host of other issues without tackling that in a serious way. So how do you recommend that people help redirect the conversation?
Make relationships with people you disagree with. That's a whole game. Be part of the army that is stitching back together the fabric of American society, and that is how you do that. Remember what it means and how it feels to respect somebody whose views make you angry. You know, every time you're on your phone or you're on your computer and you're scrolling through social and you see something that makes you feel enraged, you know that feeling that's like road rage, like, oh, I can't believe this person believes this, I have to write something on Twitter. Every time you feel that rage, someone is making $1 million. I'm being totally serious, like totally literally. Like they have hacked. It is not normal to feel that way about a stranger. And we feel that way because very, very smart people who are much smarter than you or I, have figured out how to make us feel that way about people we've never met, about our fellow Americans. And it's wrong. And you can be a person who trains yourself how not to feel that way by going to shul, by going to church, by going to volunteer, by finding spaces that are not political in your life, and making relationships with people that are not based on political agreement, and remembering what it feels like to be a Democrat, small d, you know, to respect the views of somebody you disagree with. That's the only, because you know the sad thing is that this media stuff, it's really profitable, and I just don't see it turning around. We consume too much media. We know too much stuff. You don't need to know like who AOC is angry at every single day. We don't need to know that. Like we know that because people are getting rich off of telling us that. But you can decide not to need to know that. You know, like it's not. You want to know what's going on in your community? Go find out what's happening in your community. You know, that's just. It's not satisfying, but that's all I got.
Well, I think that was actually a really good, at least start of an answer. You know, and. The first, actually, you know, a very good beginning of an answer to the first question that I had here, which was commenting on your thoughts on political polarization, what could be possible solutions. So I'm going to just move past that to another question. I often hear that the reason we, and this person writes, powerful, white, political, I apologize, I can't read the next word, don't care about the class divide is because most of the lower class is composed of minorities. So this person wants to know, is that untrue? And if it is true, is that not racism at its core? Or do you simply disagree with the premise of that? I think that in the media, when they express their sneering contempt for the working class, which is frequent, they very frequently say the white working class. But I think this question is accurate. You know, 70 to 75% of Black Americans identify as either moderate or conservative. Like when you ask them, what are your views? You know, irrespective of who they vote for, working class Americans are more conservative. And it's those views that have been totally deplatformed from the mainstream media. You know, the entire working class, everybody who's conservative, everybody who voted for Republican. You know, the New York Times didn't run a single op-ed by a Trump voter in the 6 months running up to the election in 2020. Not one. Like, how do you call yourself the paper of record and not tell your fellow Americans how your neighbor is thinking, why they're voting, you know, the way they are? So I do think that it is racist. I do, you know, there's a Yale study that really, you know, this book began with this Yale study from 2018 that I read that was so shocking and horrifying to me that I put it away and I couldn't look at it for, I think, you know, 6 months, a year, because it was such an indictment of everything that I thought I knew and everybody that I knew. The Yale study found that there was a difference between how white liberals and white conservatives talk to Black and Latino Americans, okay? Big difference. What's the difference? White liberals dumbed down their vocabulary when talking to Black and Latino Americans. They used smaller words than when they talked to other white Americans. And white conservatives didn't. And I remember reading that and thinking, there is a sickness in a worldview that produces this difference, and yet we're calling them the racists. Like, it was very eye-opening for me, and I think that that really does get at that question as well. Your words sound very much like those of John McWhorter. That will not surprise you. But this person says, a notoriously elitist conservative. How do you distinguish yourself, i.e. your views, from his? This may also be a question to which you do not entirely accept the premise.
So John McWhorter identifies as a liberal. He hates Donald Trump, which is how he was able to sneak into his newsletter job at the New York Times, probably. He really hates Trump. And I don't think he would call himself a conservative. The main difference between his work and my work is that he considers wokeness to be a religion. And I am religious, so I totally reject that premise because that's not what being religious feels like. Religion is all about like being humble and forgiveness and grace and tshuva and, you know, holding yourself to a higher standard than you hold anybody else and being, you know, always falling short of that standard and answering to a higher power and caring about, you know, your fellow Americans. So that would be the main difference. He really sees it as a religion, and I really respect his work, and I think that he has really shown leadership that a lot of us rely on. But I don't totally disagree with the elitism point. I'll just leave it at that.
Do you view the recent Virginia elections as the canary in the coal mine that will alert the left that wokeness may cause in future election losses?
Yeah. I think CNN spent the week after in a total state of discombobulation, like, ooh, what does this mean? What have we done? Now they've, of course, gone back. But I do think that there's a real shift happening underway. I think people are starting to see, I think, yeah, I do.
Well, from your lips to God's ear. Hello, thank you for the talk. This person starts with their question, very, very friendly. I've read cue cards at many talks. I don't know if I've ever seen that one started off. But here's a tough question and a good question. What black collaborators did you work with to develop your point of view? And can you please touch on the importance of such interracial collaboration?
I relied on, relationships, dear relationships in my life, as well as polling, as well as there's a whole chapter in the book about the richness of the conversation about race within the black community. A lot of intellectuals are quoted in there, really important thinkers. The views that the media tells us are the views of minority communities are not the views of minority communities, and that's very much clear from the conversations within the community, the poll. I mean, there's a lot of evidence that that's true. It just doesn't quite make it through very, very often. Great question.
So I think this person needs a new pen, but I'm going to do my best to read their question. Why do you think anti-Semitism is only or mostly in wealthy, elite communities and not in working class ones? I taught in a Title IX high school in Nashville, Tennessee. I had swastikas drawn on my classroom walls, and student Instagram pages were littered with anti-Israel posts claiming, quote, Jews were murdering Palestinians. These were all low-income whites. Does this not concern you? What should I make of this?
Great question. Again, I rely on the polling. When you poll Americans about their views on Israel and their views on Jewish issues, it does seem to be, to me, it seems like it's very much a college-educated phenomenon. I'm not very worried about teenagers doing stupid things. I'm sorry. That's probably a really terrible thing to say. I think teenagers are really stupid, and I think they do really stupid things. But there was another thing I wanted to respond to. The anti-Zionist posts. Yeah, there's like a real horseshoe effect. There was an anti-Semitic rally in Poland the other day, and they were also chanting like, go Palestinians, and like, it's just funny how like they were all right-wing nationalists. There's a real sort of horseshoe effect. Like David Duke, who's like also extremely anti-Zionist, although he's that's interesting how anti-Zionism has become a fundamental tenet of the anti-Semitic right as well. It's interesting. Yeah.
Some would even say troubling.
Troubling, yes.
So this person's just wondering if you've engaged the ideas of your book within different communities. Have you had a chance to speak to people in black in the black community, in racial minority communities, in working class immigrant communities. That's the first part of their question. The second part of their question, which I was, I think, getting at with a couple of my questions earlier, is it risky that your ideas will be misappropriated among certain sectors of white America?
I hear from people a lot. Like I was on CNN talking about this, and I heard from a lot of people.
In different communities.
Yes. I wish it was not a white person saying this. Like I would hear like, oh, I'm so grateful that you're saying this. How come they don't let us say this? And I think that's a real problem. Like the voices that get let through are the ones that endorse the progressive message. And so I at Newsweek spent a lot of time cultivating voices from working class communities, from working class black communities, immigrant communities, trying to get those working class voices in front of mainstream audiences, and to sort of counteract some of the work. About being appropriated, I don't think good ideas can be appropriated. You know, like I talk a lot to conservatives because I have a lot to say to them. And, you know, like, how is that not a good thing? Like to bring, you know, a socialist message to conservatives. I don't know, like, isn't that a great thing? Like to have something they agree with so you can go in and then tell them, influence them on all, I think that's a great thing. Like,
well, I think that the question would be, I don't want to speak for this person, but you know, what I would express concern about, and I think I was partly getting at it earlier, like I said, is the socialism is a fundamental part of your message, and I think it's a message that is also very critical of conservatives on a range of issues. But if we strip that away, then there are certainly conservatives who would join some of the things that you say without having any focus on income inequality. And I think that people worry that then it just becomes a critique of concerns about racism. And if it's just read as that, right, is that basically people talking about race are wrong, full stop, then I think it's a distortion of your message. And you know, some people, I think, maybe have fear that what you're saying could be fodder for those folks who just don't want to talk about race.
Okay. I'm an opinion editor, which means that I watch Fox News and CNN and MSNBC all day. I have all three up all day. So you could pity me a little bit for having to do that. But I can tell you that I've never once seen a segment on Fox News about critical race theory that did not begin with the person saying, obviously, we should be teaching about slavery and segregation. Never once. They always do that because the debate about critical race theory is not actually about whether or not we should be teaching racism and segregation, which is mandated in schools across the nation. So to me, it's like we're not living in an era of segregation. We're not living in an era where the other side is cartoonishly evil. We're just very lucky. We're not living at that time. And so my critique of wokeness stands, you know, I think it's dehumanizing. John McWhorter doesn't have a class element to his argument. He's just anti-woke because he thinks it's racist. And I agree with him, you know, it's like, so yes, I'm very careful about who I give my message to. I'm very careful about where I appear and who I appear next to and which shows I talk to. But like I do a lot of conservative radio because that's where the working class audience is, because the liberal media has abandoned the working class. And so the working class is consumer boycott, right? They don't tune into these places, and that's who I'm talking to. So I just feel like I'm not, you know, the less highly educated a community is, it doesn't matter what the racial composition is, they're not into wokeness. They're not into the progressive message. They're not into open borders. Like, there is so much more that unites the working class across races than unites them with people of the same race who are in the higher classes.
As a lefty, could you discuss, one, the death of journalistic ethics, which underlies media silence about real issues, and two, silence about crime in urban black communities, which I know is something that you feel strongly about?
Yeah. The taboo on discussing crime is another one of the just absolutely disgusting aspects of this. Like, liberals are embarrassed about it, so that they rather let black children be killed than talk about it, because they feel like it's embarrassing to them. I just don't understand how that's acceptable. But there is a taboo on discussing crime. So, for example, about a month ago, there was a school shooting So I was like, oh, school shooting, like, okay, all hands on deck, right? Turn on all the TVs, like, make sure this is what we're going to be covering for the next, 2 or 3 days. And it's on Fox, and I'm waiting for it to come on CNN. I'm waiting for it to come on MSNBC. It's like their bread and butter, right? School shootings. They it's like the gun control, everything, right? Waiting for it. It's not coming on. It's not coming on. It's like hours and hours. There's a manhunt. There's a manhunt on for the school shooter. 3 students were shot, a teacher was shot, and it's not on CNN and it's not on MSNBC. Why? Because the shooter was black and the people he shot were black. So it got classified as urban crime, and they literally didn't cover. They covered it when they caught him for an hour. It's just disgusting. Like, talk about devaluing black life, But we're living through a historic rise in murder. And you cannot read about it in the New York Times because there's a taboo on covering crime. Now, of course, there are outlets like Breitbart that cover black-on-black crime in a racist way. Like, yes, that's true. So do it in a not racist way. These people deserve to have a media that says this is unacceptable. We would not live this way. You will not live this way. And instead, it's just, there's a total taboo. There was a journalist who almost got fired for trying to cover it at The Intercept last year, 2 years ago. So that to me is just I'm on the other side of whoever's doing that. That's not racial justice, even though it's being done in the name of racial justice. That's not acceptable. And the person who wrote this is absolutely right. Like, that taboo on crime is just such an indictment. I talk about that in the book.
Yeah. You talk about that really well in the book. So this takes us back to the questions about anti-Semitism, and I've heard you speak about this before, so I'm looking forward to you sharing with our audience here. The question was, why do you think that anti-Zionism does not equal anti-Semitism, isn't denying the right to self-determination to only Jews, inherently anti-Semitic? How could you, how would you differentiate the two?
And so it's kind of like it's like the Obama-Trump voters, okay? Somebody who voted for Obama twice and then switched to Trump, like, we can imagine this person is not racist, right? They had no problem voting for a black president, right? They have some other reason, which means that people can have another reason for voting for Trump, right? Ergo, right, by definition. Same thing with anti-Zionism. I think that the demand that Palestinians be Zionists to avoid being called bigots is disgusting. Like, Israel came at their expense. They're allowed to be upset about it. They are allowed to say, I wish Israel didn't exist, without being called bigots. It's just, to me, like, there has to be, we have to be able to think that. A Palestinian who's living in a refugee camp in Syria, whatever you think about whether or not they should still be in a refugee camp, whatever it is, like, that person who was either kicked out or fled from Israel in 1948, who has no hope, no life, whose children have no future, they're allowed to sit there and say, I wish Israel didn't exist, without being called a bigot. Like, that's not bigotry. That's totally reasonable and rational. And it's like, in a Talmudic way, like, if we can accept that a Palestinian can be anti-Zionist without being an anti-Semite, it must be true that another person can be an anti-Zionist without being an anti-Semite. Now, it's true that if some guy in Bristol is tweeting at me every single day about how, Israel shouldn't exist or whatever, I'm going to think to myself, I wonder why this is your issue. I am going to think that. I am going to wonder about that. But the burden on me is to get some sort of proof out of him that he actually hates Jews, and not that he's just picked this issue. People can pick this issue. Like, it's okay. I have a lot of relationships in the Palestinian community. I'm happy to see people advocating for them, If it didn't go so far, there was, for a long time, you couldn't hear from Palestinians in the mainstream media in America. That was bad. We should hear from them. We should hear from them in the Jewish media. I published a lot of Palestinians at The Forward. I had a columnist every other week because it's really important, Now, that said, there are a lot of anti-Semites who are really drawn to anti-Zionism, But I think categorically, we have to accept that there is a version of this that is, anti-Zionism is opposition to a sovereign nation. It's not about self-determination. I have self-determination here. I could move to Israel. I don't want to move to Israel. I believe that my place is here. I'm an essential part of the fabric of American society. I have total self-determination. The idea that you can only have self-determination in Israel is not true. We all know that because we all live here. So I think that I support self-determination there. I think that Israel went a long way towards making Jews more safe in America, giving us, something that Black Americans still lack, which is a full citizenship here. But at the same time, I don't think that, there's clearly a lot of overlap, but I don't think they're categorically the same.
Right, and you and I agree strongly on this, and I think part of what you're saying is just how important context is for understanding people and their politics. And I think maybe that's a thread really that runs through your work, and particularly you're interested in the material conditions of people's lives as context for understanding their politics. I think that's part of your argument about the working class here and how we should read things that they say about, say, illegal immigration or criminal justice, is to look at what is the context of their life and what privilege or lack of privilege do they actually experience before we make sort of blanket case about what their words must mean and whether they must be regarded as racist, or is there a better way to understand them. So I see kind of a parallel between that and what you just said about, a Palestinian who's in a Syrian refugee camp and, is a third-generation refugee, for instance, and we say, well, if you said, no, I don't think Israel should exist, you're an anti-Semite. That's the best way to understand you. I think you make a very compelling case.
One of the things that makes America the best country on earth is the First Amendment. Like in Europe, BDS is illegal. Like you can, it's actually illegal to post in support of the boycott of Israel. Like I might be offended by the boycott of Israel, but I really, really, really want to live in a country where it's legal. Like that's one of the things that makes this the best country on earth. And I think that it's really important to point that out.
Yeah, no, I mean, we have a long tradition of people saying, I will defend your right to offend me. And I think that is also something that we, is at least a little bit lost in this moment, because we now have people feeling that they have the right to be offended and use the sense that they are offended as a reason to shut down a lot of conversations. And of course, there should be lines, and there are cases where those lines are crossed and speech can be really harmful. But the American tradition is that we have a pretty high bar for when speech really crosses a line into something that we want to totally shut down. And I think that tradition is imperiled in the context of some of the developments that you are discussing. So do you envision a potential backlash on the left against wokeness? I'm paraphrasing a question here. And do you think that's coming, that we already see that, and how might that play out in terms of shifting liberal discourse and the contours of liberalism?
I don't think there will be much of a backlash.
Okay.
Because I think, okay, again, I don't think that this is like intentional, but the economy is working very, very well for highly educated Americans. And it's working really badly for everybody else. And part of the argument I make is that this woke smokescreen for class is a way of, unconsciously protecting the interests of affluent elites. To the extent that, the economy keeps working really well for them, I don't imagine that there's going to be much of a backlash to something that is helping them still see themselves as on the side of the little guy, even as they benefit from income inequality. Like, I just don't see them giving up that economic privilege. And to me, they're very connected, these things.
So I see that. I guess the question is, since you agree that for most of these people it's not deliberate, that for many of these people they see themselves as in a genuine struggle for racial justice, could we imagine an intellectual movement where materialism really is re-inflected into the movement for racial justice, and people kind of, wake up to the fact that what they're advocating for, there's an emptiness there by not focusing on the material conditions of people's lives? Could we imagine that there's sort of a realization among at least a segment of the progressive left that these issues need their attention, and that the rhetoric that you see as dominant is hollow?
I'm going to say something really unpopular, but I think it's much more likely that that's going to come from the Republican right, from the populist right, than from the progressive left. Okay.
I don't know. I'm not a prophet. Historians are notoriously bad at predicting the future. the question, I think the question would be, if we agree that we need liberal opinion makers to be part of a movement for racial justice, will such rhetoric, if it comes from the right, have the necessary impact in terms of redirecting a movement for racial justice? If the movement that's front and center arguing for racial justice remains one that follows the course that you lament in this book, will it matter very much if there's a movement on the right that tries to focus on material conditions?
I'm sorry, I wasn't able to follow that, Ethan.
No, I'm sorry, the question wasn't clear. No, it's fine.
I've been out of Berkeley too long.
No. So you're saying that you think a movement focused on the material manifestations of racial injustice is more likely to come from the populist right than it is from the progressive left. That's what you said a minute ago. And my only question is, will it resonate in the necessary way?
No, because they're not doing it in a racial way. So it's like the criminal justice stuff, like they're very kind of quiet about it because they come at this more from a Christian point of view, so it's not something that liberals would I don't think identify as. But my real problem with Republicans is I think they have a lot of like winning agenda items that if they went into minority communities, they could really clean up, and they just don't show up. And I just think that's despicable. Like if you went to Oakland and you campaign on school choice and law and order, you get a lot of votes there, and they just don't show up. And there's something kind of like they've just sort of written off these communities as never changing. And that's another thing. When I talk to conservatives, I always say, why aren't you showing up? Show up. All you have to do is not be crazy.
Right. Okay, so this leaves us in a difficult stalemate if we don't have much optimism for opinion makers on the left to take up really the intersection of class and race. That to me, and we might have a disagreement, that to me is really what you're fundamentally drawing us to focus on, right? I think maybe in the book, from my vantage point, you throw the baby out with the bathwater a little bit in terms of the way that you want us to push race aside. And I think what your work calls our attention to is the importance of the intersection of class and race when we're thinking about racial justice. So, but I understand your pessimism about, basically you have populists on one side who maybe are going to talk a lot about class, but they don't want to talk about race. And you have white liberals on the other side who continue to talk a lot about race, but are not talking about class. So that leaves us in a tough spot. To go back to something you said a little while ago, hopefully lots of people will read your book and go out into the world and call for better conversations on these issues. I think we're basically at the end of our questions. We had a lot of good questions from the audience. I want to thank our audience, and I want to thank Batya for a wonderful conversation.